of economics and finance at the school. In his seminal work, Gary Becker explains how in a production economy, one's taste for discrimination raises their cost. In his production economy model, both labor and capital choose to discriminate despite the added cost involved. We developed a financial economy model that illustrates how predominant capital providers accept lower risk-adjusted returns by discriminating against disenfranchised small, medium-sized enterprising. In a sense, we're corroborating Becker's production economy findings. Predominant capital providers don't express, however, a taste for discrimination, but rather a deep-rooted sense that disenfranchised small and medium-sized enterprises are inferior entrepreneurs. In our model, we recognize that prejudice is a belief. Discrimination is acting on that belief. Discrimination in business is more natural to arise from underlying beliefs rather than mere tastes or preferences. Now, according to standard economic theory, we would all agree that we would expect rational investors to seek to maximize their risk-adjusted returns. Even more, we would expect them to learn over time if their behavior is suboptimal and make adjustments. That predominant capital providers underinvest in disenfranchised SMEs indicates that their belief that disenfranchised entrepreneurs pose greater risk and generate lower returns. The central question here is, can this prejudice be unlearned? We find that collectively, these predominant capital providers operate as an implicit cartel, reducing supply of capital to disenfranchised SMEs while earning superior risk-adjusted returns on investments in disenfranchised SMEs.
Greetings, Khasadyahu here. So for an economic thinker, there are two problems here with the existence of persistent discrimination. First, the economist would ask, why don't investors maximize their risk-adjusted returns? Money is green is a saying in the US. Our dollars are made out of green paper, and the idea is investment should reflect what's best for money, not what's personal. One of the solutions that our model provides is that investments do indeed reflect portfolio optimizing behavior. However, this is under a set of prejudiced beliefs. The second problem an economist would ask is, why don't investors eventually learn about their error in beliefs? So you shouldn't be wrong forever. You should rationally update, and your allocation of capital should reflect learning. Our solution to this second issue is that, first of all, strong prior beliefs develop intergenerationally. The second issue is that both the average and the variance of entrepreneurial ability is on loan. When it comes to Bayesian updating, if you don't know the variance of something, it takes a lot of data to come up with an idea of what the average is. So this is our model setup and setting here. We obviously have the firms that are the capital seekers. Again, these are small and medium-sized firms. The entrepreneurs run the firm, and the entrepreneurs can be thought of as indeed the face of the firm when it comes to financing. All of these entities, they're both predominant and disenfranchised versions. Investors are external equity capital providers, and lenders provide loans or external debt capital. So with these inputs, these financial inputs, we have a process that goes from financing into generating value. So you'll see Delta 1 there. Delta stands for dividends in our model. Dividends are what the firms produce of value, and dividends are a function of three financing elements. That large A is just a scaling factor that lets you know if the units are in hundreds of thousands, millions, or tens of millions of dollars. So that first term there, the little e, is the equity that the entrepreneur, him or herself, puts into their own firm. Capital big E is the external equity investment that comes from the investors, the angel investors. And big L there represents the loan or liability arm of financing. The beta and alpha superscripts there represent how effective the firm is at converting financing into value, ROA calibration measure. The middle term there, where you subtract the loan minus I for interest, this just represents paying back any debt that the firm owes. Now this final third term here, where you have epsilon 1, epsilon is a noisy error term that represents entrepreneurial ability. And this is where the juice in our model is. The entrepreneur can help or hurt from value. And there's some random element to how effective the entrepreneur is. We scale this entrepreneurial factor by the amount of capital they have, the little e plus the big E plus the liabilities. That is the entrepreneurial equity plus external equity plus any debt they have. In other words, the bigger your balance sheet is, the more the entrepreneur can either help or hurt generate value for the firm. And that entrepreneurial factor on the second line you'll see there, we set as normally distributed. So here's a visual transforming equity on your horizontal x-axis into dividends or value on your vertical y-axis. And what you'll see, naturally, the more equity a firm has, the more value they're able to create, but that slows down as you increase. So this is the law of diminishing returns. The gray band surrounding that represents the noise, the risk, the uncertainty that comes from the entrepreneurial factor. So as you also see, the more equity a firm has, the more that it's loaded upon entrepreneurial risk, which could be for good or for bad, higher or lower outcomes, besides the deterministic financing aspect. So we'll go to the next slide and we'll zoom in here and see some examples of what optimal investment should be. So if you look at that red dot kind of on the right, this is how an investor, an angel investor, would maximize their expected returns. And this is the classic marginal cost equals marginal revenue. In our setting, the marginal cost is how much equity they put in, and the marginal revenue is how much dividend they get out. Now, one of the things that makes our model unique, because we're in a financial setting, is that there's risk. So if you look at the red box, this is actually the optimal investment for an investor who is risk averse. So now we see that risk aversion will cause investors to reduce the amount of equity they supply. So now you can understand, if an investor believes an entrepreneur carries more risk because they're from a disenfranchised group, that investor will invest less equity with that entrepreneur. So the second half of our paper looks at Bayesian updating to see if prejudice gets unlearned. So we've started with the prior belief that the investors have, and in this prior belief, the true average and the true variance of entrepreneurial ability is unknown. The second step is for the investor to observe data. What that means is for the investor to actually do deals. So a predominant capital provider doing some financing with a disenfranchised entrepreneur, and then looking at what the outcome is. After having a few of these outcomes, the investor will then formulate their posterior belief about entrepreneurial quality. And so we are able with this setup to do a simulation on how long, in other words, how many deals would it take for investors to realize that they're actually under-investing in disenfranchised firms. And what we find, so we're comparing prejudiced behavior to a benchmark. That benchmark
You have 2 more minutes.
Returns. So our main takeaways is that perceived risk is a really important aspect for how prejudice takes place. And this cartel effect that we talk about with capital providing, the cartel holds together without breaking down because all the cartel players believe that they're actually behaving in an optimal way. They just have the same beliefs that stick them together. So in theory, realized outcomes should help them learn, but without enough transactions between predominant capital providers and disenfranchised entrepreneurs, learning will be very slow.
And so for that reason, we believe some policy implications are that SMEs will have to gain support from government entities in order to entice capital providers, predominant capital providers, to invest in them. And we see that two things can happen. Either governments, probably the federal government, could provide a guarantee, a return guarantee that tells capital providers that if they increase their investment in SMEs, then the government would guarantee that their returns would be no lower over a 5 or 10-year average, so that in their portfolio, the effect of SMEs will not affect their overall return. The other policy implication we came up with, and this may have been tried back in the 60s, early 70s, would be for the government to provide tranches of subordinated debt under senior tranches of debt provided by primary capital providers, which would allow the losses that they might incur to be covered by that subordinated government debt. We'd like to thank you so much for the opportunity to present.
Thank you, Professor.